The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the notable matters in respect of this legislation, which wasn't unduly delayed at Select Committee, indeed it was reported back within a reasonable time by Select Committee and has been put on the order paper by the government reasonably promptly thereafter, and yet between the time of its first reading and now there's a lot of political events have happened. It was introduced by the Honourable Peter Dunn, whose dishonour was later highlighted by the Prime Minister, who removed him. Don't be uncharitable at Christmas time, I've heard from Mr Hayes. Well, charity should only go so far, and the National Party are always talking about that there should be limits to the beneficence of government, and to see it being contemplated that Peter Dunn, having been forced to resign for having leaked the Kitteridge report, is now, according to the minister, the Prime Minister, it's now a possibility that to keep his sort of shaky coalition going and to maintain some sort of prospect of however slim of winning the next election by shoehorning him back into Hario Belmont. He's now saying that he is a person who he might reinstate, perhaps back to the revenue, which is just, I would think, would be diabolically low standards. Mr Speaker, in respect of the Taxation Annual Rates, Foreign Superannuation and Remedial Matters Bill, I note that we're voting for this legislation because it does have some good remedial provisions, but I would also note that shouldn't be taken as acceptance by us that the annual rates of income tax for the 2013-14 year, which are effectively set by Clause 3 of this bill, and include the tax cuts of the National Party in the last term, we don't accept that they were fair. 40% of them went to the top 10% of income tax earners, and this bill entrenches the effect of that by continuing that circumstance into the future. And of course that is one of the reasons why New Zealand has the highest rate of inequality that we have had since good records began. It is one of the reasons why that inequality continues to grow, and if people weren't already worried about the effects of inequality, they would have been doubly concerned when they had the report coming out from the International Measurement of Educational Performance this year, which showed some dire decrease in educational performance of 15-year-olds. Not all the fault of this government, but some of it is the fault of this government, given that 5 years into their government those results are poorer than they were last time they reviewed, most significantly in maths and science, and that, of course, according to that report, is in part driven by increasing inequality. It's not the only reason for it, but an important part of the reason for declining educational performance in New Zealand schools, according to that report, is increasing inequality. And of course, the tax rates that are referred to at Clause 3 of this bill are one of the causes of that rising inequality. Mr Speaker, my colleague David Clark referred to the remedial matters that are addressed in this bill, and then started to list some of the remedial matters that ought to be in the bill and aren't, and threaten our tax base and undermine the strength of our economy. And I want to mention a couple more. We have known now for more than 5 years, admittedly, that would have started before the end of the last government, but has become far more prevalent a problem, is revenue being taken out by overseas companies from the New Zealand economy without paying tax on the effective profits they make in the New Zealand jurisdiction. And in the last 5 years, since this government has been in power, we've seen the explosion of the internet as a source of commerce, and we've seen increasing advertising revenues being garnered out of the New Zealand economy by Google and by Facebook, to name but two, and virtually no tax is paid by those entities on the revenues that they take out of the New Zealand economy. Now that is wrong, both in a tax fairness sense, both in terms of the loss of revenue to the Crown, but also, perhaps more importantly, on the effect of New Zealand-based businesses who employ people in New Zealand who do face a tax burden. So whether it's the Fairfax Group or the APN Group, who employ journalists, including the journalists who we rely upon in the press gallery here to keep democracy honest and to present to the New Zealand public the differing policies that different parties stand for, whether it's those newspapers or other groups, they are being severely, and I do mean severely, disadvantaged relative to groups that do not pay taxation in New Zealand but compete with those newspapers and other and radio stations and television, compete with those for advertising revenue and don't pay tax on it. And I think it is very, very lax of the government to have done nothing effective to control that tax avoidance, and this bill doesn't do it. Similarly, we have, and this is a complaint I hear from New Zealand businesses in Auckland, including big businesses, successful business people, men and women who complain it is not fair that there is so much multinational tax avoidance, transfer payments that are being made to overseas jurisdictions in order to limit New Zealand profits and therefore taxes. For example, Mr Hay might not understand this, but he should pay attention because it's not just happening in Facebook and Google. There are transfer payments that are being made in respect of intellectual payment property transactions. For example, the uses of trademarks and things are being used to take revenue out of New Zealand, overstate New Zealand expenses so as to decrease notional profit, taxable profits in New Zealand, and therefore to decrease taxation in New Zealand. And again, that's not fair to other taxpayers, because those other taxpayers have to effectively pay the taxes that the government needs in order to fund pensions and education and health services, and that burden falls on other taxpayers. It doesn't disappear. Neither is it fair to the New Zealand-owned companies who don't play those same tricks and do pay a higher effective rate of taxation. The hollowing out of New Zealand's corporate tax base in this way is something that I'm not surprised the National doesn't pay much attention to, because we know that they make lots of unprincipled decisions in this space, whether it's for Rio Tinto, paying them $40 million subsidy in order to get the Meridian sale off the books, and John Hay shakes his head, but he seems to have missed that one as well. That happened, what's that? Christmas Grinch, according to John Hayes. Actually, no, if that $40 million sat in the government's accounts, the government would be able to do $40 million of good things for New Zealanders, quite the opposite of being the Christmas Grinch. Another example where we have had poor practice which effectively wastes taxes is in the corporate welfare that we are seeing and have seen in respect of other corporates from the big end of town whose interests are preferred by National. Mr Speaker, I want to say some positive things in respect of the bill because we are voting for it. Two notable things for me. I do think that the prior rules that related to taxation of foreign superannuation funds were wrong. They were discouraging people from transferring money in. They were so complex that most people couldn't understand them, and a lot of people accordingly ignored them. There was therefore a difficult policy decision to be made. Because the rules were so arcane, at one level we had a bit of sympathy for people who weren't meeting those rules. On the other hand, we ought not to be rewarding people for not voluntarily complying with their tax obligations. This bill tries to strike the right balance, collect some tax, get people into the tax system but not unduly penalise them and not make them too well off compared with the people who did, despite complexity, meet their tax obligations. I think we've got to the right position there. The other point that I would support is some of the other changes made to ensure that if someone says that they've got a write-off mining expenditure at exploratory phase, but then, because the mine wasn't going to proceed, but then miraculously finds that they can develop the mine, then the tax deductions that they've had at the exploratory phase ought to be written back, and they ought to have to amortise them over the period of the mine rather than just keep the money that they've had the benefit of from the earlier tax deduction. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr.